All right, video rack number 5. This guy is fully built out, has everything I could possibly need when I get to a conference in it. And I'm gonna tell you why it was great, it worked really well, and I'm gonna take it all apart and build a smaller version of it, and you'll see why in a sec. So the video rack, let's take a look at the front here. I think this is a 16U, maybe slightly larger, I'll count it in a sec. Video rack. This is built with the ATEM 2ME Constellation HD. All right, that is this switcher right here. It's one of the newer ones for Blackmagic. The switcher itself is awesome. Anyone who's kind of in this field is like trying to get their hands on one because it's perfect for conferences. You're not doing 40 inputs, you're doing closer to 20, maybe even just 10 or 5. It's got a super source in it. It's got plenty of aux outs for what you really need. Going to projectors, going to conference monitors, going to multi-views and things like that. That's why this rack is so powerful. It's the aux outs, plenty of inputs, and of course it has the super source and all the other bells and whistles that are really nice to have in a professional switcher. So if we're gonna go top to bottom here, in the front of the rack, we have just trip light power switch, that's normal. Network switches, and then I have some USB power distribution there. That is for all of these decimator converters. I'll get to that in a sec. Lots of patch panels in this one, a total of 3 patch panels, and that's just so when you're setting up and this thing is facing the side of the table that you're working on, it's way easier to plug stuff in than to have to go to the back of the rack all the time. The back of the rack has a lot of patch cables, but you don't really need to go to the back for much at all. So everything's on the front, and my thought was that would speed things along. You have the switcher here. This is a very custom shelf. It was based on the idea that why doesn't someone make a 1U or a 2U that's just a whole bunch of converters? Everyone in this field knows that we're constantly converting from HDMI to SDI back and forth. Whether we have monitors on our tables, whether we have laptops or computers that we need to plug in, whether the client brings something over that we need to plug in, and vice versa. So having HDMI to SDI connections is very helpful, and these end up just getting put down on the table, plugged in just when you need it. So I thought if I could just have a bunch of them ready to go, already wired in, that should speed things up. Below that, I'll get to these cables in a second. Below that, I have more patch, another patch panel for, again, just lots of SDI ins and outs. This one is more SDI outputs, and I have a distribution box in the back here that just splits one program feed, or technically an aux out, and it splits it up into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or just really 7 outputs right there. The reason I have 7 program outputs is because I use the Blackmagic SDI cameras, the studio cams, and they need an SDI feed going into them in order to get camera control. When you run it through the Blackmagic distribution box, what you can do is you can just take any of your aux outs, plug it right into the camera, and you get that control, which really is happening on like channel 13, 14, or 15, 16 of like the audio channels. At least that's what I think. So that's how this works. That's why I have so many SDI outs. It's so I can plug in up to 20 cameras and have enough ports to control all of the studio cams. So that's these guys here. Again, another power strip, some ventilation, and then finally I have 9 hyperdecks. 9 hyperdecks is definitely overkill. 3 of them here are wired back into the switcher as well as coming out of the switcher. That way I can use them for playbacks and things like that, but I can use them all for records. Why 9? In case I wanted to do ISO records or some playbacks and some records. ISO records just means isolated recordings, so I can loop certain cameras and things through the hyperdeck before they get to the switcher. I can come out of the switcher and into a hyperdeck to record an output. They're all timecode synced and things like that in the back. But honestly, I don't trust the hyperdecks indefinitely. I've done enough where I've had some bad luck. Certain cards get corrupted, they overheat, things like that. So they haven't overheat and crash, but they definitely freeze and whatnot. So I always, if I'm recording something important and I'm doing it on a hyperdeck, I'll at least have 2, maybe even 3 hyperdecks recording. You know, you can't get SD cards in crazy large capacities like you can an SSD. And because these only take SD cards, these ones do. You know, I've had times where I forget to swap the SD cards out, an SD card gets full, and then I didn't put a second one in, so it didn't automatically fail over, things like that. So having redundancies, you know, here is very important. So again, airflow, hyperdeck, and finally at the bottom, this is actually probably the most important patch panel here. These are my input patch panels. I have XLR for audio coming in, again, into the switcher here. That way I can come off an audio board, plug right into the rack. And then I have all my camera inputs here. So I have some inputs up here. These are HDMI inputs. They kind of start at 7 or technically 9, depending. And then down here, I have like 8 SDI ins, and then I start at a different one up here. These cables up here. So in certain situations when I was thinking things out about building this, I was like, how many cameras am I really gonna have? How many laptops on the table or HDMI sources am I really going to have? What if I have more SDI cameras this time, but then I have more HDMI sources in a different time? These cables jump right into either converters or into the back of the switcher here, which means if I basically want to change things on the fly, I don't have to go to the back of the rack. I can just take this one right here, I can plug it into something else and get a feed either coming out of or going into the switcher. Let's take a look at the back. I can explain a little bit more, but that's the front of this rack, super capable, and you hopefully never have to touch the back of the rack. Obviously, it's always gonna be open for airflow, and I have some storage back there as well, but you shouldn't need to go back there in the middle of a show or even for setup of a show. So this is the back of the rack. So, one thing I was very proud of, and it's kind of the reason I have such a big case like this, or at least one of the reasons, is I store an entire monitor back here. Specifically, I believe this guy is, I think, a 24-inch, maybe it's slightly bigger. So there's nice padding right here. That's where the display sits up against. I then put 2 of these kind of spacers in here just to keep this guy from moving around. And the reason I chose this particular monitor, 1, it fit really well. 2, it's very thin. And 3, the stand on the back folds into it. A lot of these monitors, you have stands that you have to take apart, put them away, or you keep them together and they're super bulky. This one is really thin, so the stand is just built into the back of it. So you just pull it out and it just sits. Just like that. So it is a friction stand, which just means you can kind of tilt it whatever you want. This monitor happens to be a touchscreen. It does not need to be a touchscreen. I don't use it as one, but I thought that couldn't hurt in the future if I wanted like a touchscreen surface. The monitor's already prepared. But it's an HDMI in, 1080p, nothing fancy. We're not doing 4K, at least not here. And I use this one for a multi-view. So basically when I go on site, I'll set up the rack next to the table. I will take my monitor here, I will drop it down somewhere close to the rack, and then just 2 cables, an HDMI and a power. Because I have so many ports on the front here, I really am not even going to the back of the rack. I'll leave this here, and I'll just start taking an HDMI into the monitor, a power cable into the monitor, and I'll start setting up my stuff. My network cables, all that comes out the front. So all that's really left back here is master power cable, okay? And then I do keep a USB-C cable back here. I could leave it in the front as well. I didn't find a good Thunderbolt patch bay. If you guys know of one, let me know. But currently I do have this deck link in the back here. That deck link is used for ProPresenter in my case, but it also can be a video input and output for other applications as well. But I have a nice long Thunderbolt cable that goes from this deck link card here in the enclosure, already pre-wired, and it runs to a laptop I have on the desk. Lots of patch cables here, lots of wiring. I didn't do too much really wire management here. There is a good amount going on, but I didn't do a crazy amount. I kind of wanted to be able, if I needed to rewire something, I wanted to be able to do that. That's why this guy's right here. I can easily get under and over. I didn't close it off. I want to have options when I'm on site. I don't want to have, I don't want to use those options. I don't want to need to use the options, but I like having options. So that was my thinking back here. Nothing's glued in or zip tied too tight or anything like that. I can pull a cable out, move it, patch it somewhere else. We're not like perfectly fit with our cables. We have excess, which is good. From the very first YouTube video we put up, one of the things I said in that rack build, and the rack was similar in size, but a whole lot less stuff in it, was better sized cables, like more accurately sized, and more color options. So I actually got to use that advice when I built this rack. All these yellow cables here, they're all going down into one of these SDI distribution boxes. This is the box I talked about a little bit earlier. And all it does is it splits kind of one input into either 7 or 8 outputs. So I got to color code things a little bit where I know all these yellow cables are used for that purpose, right? It has enough inputs and outputs for pretty much everything that you need on site for a conference. When you get into building out a studio and whatnot, you probably want a little bit more because you don't want to have to rewire things for every different occasion. But when you go on site, it's a little more custom. You're wiring for a specific use, not for every use. Okay, let's plug this guy in and see what we can get to do. Here because I know I'm going to get questions about it. I do bring another rack with me a lot of the times, and this one houses the scopes, right? Because I didn't fit the scopes into the main rack, so I do have scopes here. The reason I have a whole other rack with just some scopes in it is one, a lot of times this is somewhere else. If someone is doing the coloring or something like that, or I need these for aux outs for somewhere else, maybe it's the director's table or something like that, I can put this over there, route whatever I want to those scopes for that other reason. The other reason I have this giant case for these scopes is because I store some extra monitors in here. And again, these monitors are smaller, they have the stands on them, right? But the good thing about them is I don't have to take them apart. They can just sit with all of their stands connected, ready to go, power supplies there, and then they just sit in here, throw some foam in, and they travel nice and safe. And they were just perfect size to be able to fit with both the front and the back on this case. So they fit in here really nicely. And so a lot of times, if I need to, I can just take this rack and I can move it right next to the other one. And they could live like this. I could flank the table with them, whatever I need. Size-wise, they're pretty similar. And I've done stuff before where I didn't have enough space, so I just take one of the monitors out and I put it on top of these racks. And now if the client is working with us and they want to come because we're doing this big record or a show or whatever, I could have just monitors for them up here, and that way they can kind of see everything for themselves, be able to give notes. If we're doing like a setup day or rehearsal day, they can sit back here and we can go over the show. They can see all of the content, playbacks, graphics, what the live stream's going to see. If we're doing multiple outputs, I can set those up. So that's why I have 2 racks that work together really well, but this one isn't necessary. I can easily run the whole show and do everything with just the one. And then cabling wise, there's a harness in the back of there with 4 SDIs on it. I can come right out of this rack off the front into that rack there. I can pop it down through the front of it. So this rack is the brains, that one's a helper, but it does have a lot of extra monitors and things like that. Again, foamed up just to keep them safe. All right, so that's the whole rack here. A couple things I wanted to touch on just to make sure. You see these 2 converters over here, they are for my multi-view. So the ATEM 2ME Constellation HD has 2 multi-view outs. I am looping them through the converters, and I am also putting them back into the switcher so I can route them out of any aux. That is a trick that a lot of people use in the industry, to just route your multi-view back into the switcher. Yes, you get a couple frame delay when you do that. If you're not super concerned about your delay though, it gives you more options. You can route them wherever you want them to go and things like that, as an input to an output. So I am looping them through here, so I have multi-view outs via SDI. I have multi-view outs via HDMI as well. So that is a perk. And again, I could run it back into the switcher if I want to and things like that with these cables here. So that's the whole rack. Things that worked really well about this rack, obviously the switcher of choice, maybe just one patch panel, like one very full patch panel instead of having so many different ones. I probably won't do as many hyperdecks next time. I'll just do, maybe I'll get a different set of hyperdecks. Maybe I'll do the hyperdeck 8K that can do 4 records at the same time. I probably just won't do as many hyperdecks. It takes up a lot of space. I do find that on site, I'm not doing as much ISO recording. I'm more just doing a program record. So I'd feel confident if I just had maybe just 2 hyperdecks instead of all of them. But again, I might even, build an A10 Mini Extreme into it and get ISOs that way. We'll see on the next one. What else? The network switch worked really well, and that's it. Like my biggest problem with this whole rack was not what it was capable of or how much time it really saved me. It was how big it was, and it wasn't that practical. Unless I'm bringing the entire conference with me, which I'm not doing all the time. I'm not always setting up the projectors and screens. I'm not bringing all the furniture and the draping and kind of everything that goes into the conference. A lot of times I'm walking into something where the projector and screen's provided by someone else, and I'm just pushing the content, running the show, bringing my cameras and the switcher, and then just running signal places, but not really, not doing everything that it takes. So it's kind of a pain if you have to put this in a large SUV or kind of bring a van or a truck. And on those shows, I'm really doing it with less people when I'm not doing everything. If I have a giant crew, bringing racks like this is not a problem. So learn from my experience, built the whole rack out. It's got everything that I would want in it at the moment. But I'm probably gonna take it apart and build a much smaller version with less capabilities. It was just too overkill to make sense, to make it worth to bring out, right? It only works for very large shows. It doesn't work for a small show. And honestly, I don't wanna buy a bunch of these switchers, so I want one or couple systems maybe I can put together that works for a larger show, but I want it to be practical. You need to want to take it out on the road. You don't wanna be like, I'll use a smaller system because I don't wanna bring out the big system. It doesn't make sense to have a giant system. So I'm gonna make a smaller rack now. Look out for that video whenever that comes. But I don't know why people aren't doing this. I did have one problem before I brought it out. When I was building it, I was testing it out. I had one bad converter. But since then, these guys have been great. If someone wants to build this, Decimator, if you're watching, and Blackmagic, whatever, if someone wants to build a 1U rack that has a whole bunch of converters in it, maybe like 8. I feel like that's a good number. Like 8, and it's just they're bidirectional converters, that's it. Preferably you can get it in a 1U, and it would probably look like a video hub. If you could build a video hub with half HDMIs and half SDIs, that would be awesome too. That would be even better. But either way, that's that. So I hope you like the rack. If you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out. If you like the rack, please let me know. If you didn't like the rack, don't even comment. And thanks for watching.